I was thinking about the way we often speak about the Quran on exploring the Quran and the Bible, and very often they're like large universal comments, like the Quran is this, the Quran is that. And what if we didn't have this sort of like wide view, global view of the Quran, but we looked at one particular chapter or unit of the Quran? And it's kind of like, you hear about someone, you hear about Taylor Swift or someone in these like general terms, like great singer or terrible singer or whatever. But if you actually spend an hour, let's say, sharing a cup of coffee and like speak to them, you have a whole new view. So that's what we're going to try to do today on exploring the Quran and the Bible. We're going to take a close-up view at one piece of the Quran, and we're going to notice stuff that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And just think this is like, having coffee with the Quran as though you were, I mean, obviously it's different, but, getting to know someone on closer terms. Hi, Hassan, how are you doing?
Good, great to be here, Gabriel.
Yeah, thanks for being with me. So our surah, our chapter of the Quran for our discussion is Quran 21, which is usually known as Surah Al-Anbiya, the chapter of the prophets. But I mean, I'd like to kind of start, Hassan, just like stepping back a little bit by saying, this term surah, we hear it in terms of, in Quranic studies, and it's worth just kind of noting, like, I mean, people sometimes translate it just as chapter, but what's unique about this word is it appears in the Quran. So the Quran itself refers to something called a surah, right? So, do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like
Yes,
that's like when
there's
people say
a number
chapters of
of
the Bible,
famous instances of this.
yeah, totally. And like chapters of the Bible, I don't think the Bible probably ever speaks of a chapter, and the chapters are imposed by the later tradition to
Right.
organize the text, all this. That's not the case with the 114 surahs of the Quran. So, yeah, like, I mean, I don't know if you're alluding to that, but sometimes the Quran says, like, hey, opponents, can
Yes.
you guys do a surah?
Or bring a surah like it.
Yeah, bring a surah like it.
That's
Yeah.
a big challenge, the very famous challenge.
So now, I mean, just to note, we're going to move on quickly from this point, but just to note, like, that doesn't mean necessarily that when the Quran has God or has God tell the Prophet to say something about a surah, that corresponds to any of the 114 units of the text that we have today. It could be like, just kind of a block of text or a passage that might be recited. And so, still, it's kind of, I mean, it could be that it's nevertheless the tradition that came to refer to the 114 units of the text as surahs because they were aware of these passages in the Quran. I don't know if that is clear, Hassan.
Absolutely. I think there's always a lot of work that has to be done when we're thinking about this historically and from a historical critical perspective of not being sort of not taking too much for granted from just the ways that people have discussed this historically, in history.
I guess that goes for the word Quran itself,
Right.
which kind of maps on in a similar way to Surah in regard to these questions. We're speaking about Quran 2021. Western scholarship, still lots of people like to use the numbers. In Islamic tradition, of course, people refer to the surahs by their names. 21 is called Al-Anbiya, which means the prophets. The word Anbiya does not actually appear in Quran 21.
But it's
So
quite an apt name for the surah, I would say,
because of
of the
the
prophets. Yes.
narrative section, yeah. So you have like Al-Fatiha and other surahs, Al-Ikhlas, and where this is also the case. So the tradition gave a name based more or less on the content of the surah, even though that word doesn't appear in the surah. I guess that's enough. I mean, should we jump into
Yeah.
some content?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I'm just going to comment briefly on the date and the structure of Quran 21, like in general terms, and then I'm going to share my screen. We're actually going to look at the text together, Arabic and English. We're going to use the old school translation of Arthur Arbery, which some people hate because it's very flowery and stuff, but he was a smart guy. Anyway, so in terms of date, by tradition, this is a Meccan surah. By Meccan surah, folks mean that it was proclaimed when Muhammad was in Mecca between the years AD 610 and 622. I wrote down here, Hassan, I did a little research on the date, traditional dating. Noldeke, the famous German guy who sort of started working on the dating from a critical perspective, says it was the 65th. I mean, elsewhere he says in his work,
Yes.
you can't really be sure of an exact number or order, but nevertheless, according to Noldeke, it's a 65th sort of proclaimed, which means it's in what he calls the middle Meccan period. There's that. And if we want to run with these categories of Meccan and Medinan, there's not a lot of so-called Medinan stuff here, I would say.
Yeah,
So
and Noldeke is inheriting to some degree these categories from Islamic exegesis and tafsir, Islamic theology, and he's expanding them a little bit. So,
totally, yeah.
yeah.
And so, typical Meccan stuff, what people think of as the Meccan material in the Quran, warnings of the day of judgment, polemics against the prophet's opponents, description of nature as, blessings or signs of God and his benevolence. A lot of this stuff. And what's missing is the so-called Medinan stuff, like, law, legal passages, polemic against Christians and Jews. At least I don't think there's much polemic against Christians and Jews. There is against, like, the mysterious opponents. There's really nothing on jihad here, I think. Yeah. And then in terms of structure, a lot of Western scholars, most famously Angelika Neuwirth, like to say that these kinds of surahs, the Middle Meccan surahs, basically have a three-part structure. And, some folks, I think Mehdi Azayas, who wrote a really good commentary on this in the French work, Le Coran des Historiens, he says basically 1 to 47, verses 1 to 47, and then at the end, verses 96 to 112, kind of bookend with polemic, a middle narrative section, 48 to 95. So I think that's all I'm going to say about like general stuff. Is there anything to add there?
No, I think you more or less nailed it. We can talk. We could discuss the merits of the Noldeke chronology till the cows come home. So, I think for now it's something we can sort of roll with.
Plus, there are problems with the whole dating. There are
Yeah.
ways to attack it. But if we should be true to our promise, I guess, and carry on and look at sort of 21. So you can see my screen, okay, Hassan?
Yep.
All
Great.
right. So yeah, let's kind of divide our analysis into the three principal sections that at least Mehdi Azayas in his commentary divides sort of 21 into. And we're not going to go verse by verse because there's 112 verses here. And so, that wouldn't be entertaining a YouTube viewing. And, we are interested both in high quality academic communication and entertainment. I thought, if we could sort of jump ahead, there's a polemic about, the prophet, he's just a person. How could just a
Right.
person be a messenger of God? There's this bit interesting, verse 8. Prophets are, they're just
Mortals.
people. Yeah,
Yes.
they eat food. They're not immortals. I guess that. If we want to say something here, that's kind of interesting, right? That
Yeah.
there's an at least attributed to the opponents is an expectation that a real messenger would be something like supernatural.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it connects with other parts of the Quran where the rejoinder to what could be, you could think of as some Christian beliefs in late antiquity that, Christ and Mary did not need food or that they were, their bodies were sort of uncorruptible naturally. And the Quran also makes this argument for their humanity, you could say, based on them eating food. So
Yeah, totally. With both Jesus and Mary, that's
absolutely.
explicitly said, and I think it's an important point that that same theme comes up here in sort of 21. I think it's important to add too in this opening section just the point that the Quran is quoting. Wait, let me rephrase that because I think that's the question. Is it actually quoting the opponents? I mean, like,
Yes,
let's
yeah.
say this was proclaimed in Mecca. I just give a random year to it. Let's say, it's supposed to be Middle Meccan. So let's say 617 or 618 in, the Miladi or the CE dates. So, the Prophet is in Mecca. Does this mean that a month earlier, a day earlier, a week earlier, that the opponents of Muhammad actually said these words, which Arbery very fancifully renders into English a hodgepodge. Don't say that word very often.
Not anymore, at least. Yeah.
Hodgepodge of nightmares. Nay, he has forged it. Obviously, in principle, they would have said it in Arabic. They refer to iftara there as a verb. He forged it. He is a poet. Did they actually say bel huwa shi'r?
Yeah.
Or is the Quran creating a kind of theatrical, I don't know, a text in which it's writing lines for the opponents of the Prophet for the sake of its own argument?
Yeah, I think it's interesting parallel to some of the other debates we see in late antiquity, in Christian theological debates, Jewish debates. But I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes the patristic sources do quote their opponents, even sometimes hundreds of years later.
Right.
But very often it's that's not the case. But you could see. I mean, I think it's plausible that there could be some like a resonance of the debate, sort of in Mecca or
Yeah,
elsewhere.
I
That
think
this
that's a good
is
term.
this is
Yeah.
reflecting, but a sort of verbatim quoting is very difficult, and I think generally uncommon unless you're dealing with a written text. So some patristic sources, in like against Celsus or Celsus or
Mhm.
Eunomius or something, will have the writings of or works attributed to Celsus and Eunomius, and they'll quote it and try to refute, but this is not, I don't think, the context in which this surah is operating.
I mean, there's a couple of interesting points here. One is I think Nikolai Sinai agrees with you. He speaks of like these kinds of discourse, counter discourse passages in the Quran, allegedly, well, with direct speech, literally speaking, but allegedly with verbatim speech. I think he speaks of this as like the gist of real conversations. I mean, I think that could be debated. One reason potentially to debate it is like the question that actually Stephen Shoemaker raises in his book Creating the Quran about memory science. I don't know if you have
Yes,
thought much about his
yes,
arguments there, but he says basically, if you actually study whether people are able to like verbatim recall things without the aid of a written text that they can go back to control their memory, like actually there's almost no verbatim recollection possible. Uh, so yeah. Plus, like, even if it were possible, I don't know if you want to comment on the memory science thing, but
right.
even if it were possible, I mean, let's say, I had a debate about, food, like, what's the best place to get a pizza in South Bend, Indiana with someone. It got really, okay, it's a little fanciful, but it got really heated and stuff. We were really fighting. And a couple of days later, I now no longer friends with the guy I was debating with. And someone's like, dude, what happened? Like, what was your conversation like? And I quote my opponent's words. Would I quote like verbatim his words, or would I, create or recreate the conversation
Right.
in a way that makes me look really smart? And
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would probably do the latter, but but you could think of something like, Bal huwa sha'ir. Maybe. Like that's a very small, the accusation of the Quran's messenger being a sha'ir is
poet, yeah,
a poet, right?
yeah.
Is sort of pervasive. So maybe, I think for larger sort of blocks and in general the sort of verbatim arguments, probably not. But something like the accusation, like words that describe an accusation, being a poet or being mad, maybe. Yeah.
Why do you think, Hassan, that the Quran is interested in raising this accusation, whether these are the verbatim words of its opponents or not? Why is it interested in raising and subsequently refuting this particular accusation that Muhammad was a poet?
Yeah, I mean, because so many people have remarked on this, and it's one of the most sort of apparent aspect of the Quran, even to non-Arabic speakers, is its poetic qualities, right? And I mean, this is it seems like an easy charge. I don't know if we can know too much about the nature of poets in Arabia
It's
in
almost like an
Muhammad's time.
anthropological question, right? Like
Yeah,
in that culture at that time, what did poet mean?
some
And
people have claimed that there are sort of additional sort of there's an additional sort of pejorative sense of being a
Mhm.
poet. I'm not entirely convinced of that. It may or may not be so, but
like what would
certainly
a
the Quran,
2025
yeah, like
2025 equivalent?
a charlatan, maybe one could
Yeah.
say,
Okay.
or a sophist, I guess, could be a decent example.
Yeah.
But the
I don't
Quran
know how
has a
2025 that
well,
is.
no, they're not saying this in
Hassan, you're showing your
2025.
classical knowledge of I was
But
thinking like he's just like a I don't clickbait TikToker or
yeah,
something.
well, the 2025 example is a grifter,
A grifter, yeah,
or a
yeah.
grift,
Okay, very good, very good. Yeah.
but I don't know. It's hard to say for the specific weight of this term, but I mean, it is a very something the Quran very much wants to defend the messenger from.
Right. And anyway, more could be
Yeah.
said about that because
I'll
obviously
say
within go
one
ahead.
last thing maybe
Go ahead.
is just
Yeah.
that there's maybe a sense that this isn't just sort of nice sentiment or a poetic recapitulation of sort of older stories, right? Biblical lore. I think that also ties into the Quran's sort of defensiveness in other places. It has the the opponents of the messenger.
Asatir al-awwalin, that famous
Exactly.
phrase. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fables of the ancients.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, we could say a lot more about poetry. In particular, Islamic tradition in the exegetical or tafsir tradition takes that up and defines the Quran very carefully as not poetry, of course. But let's, if it's okay, jump ahead
Yes.
now to a passage beginning in verse 30. So up here, verse 29, you probably can't avoid looking at that one for a moment because there's the threat of hell or Gehenna there for anyone who claims to be divine. But if it's okay, let's speak a moment about this passage from verse 30. I mean, I guess it basically goes to verse 33, so these 4 verses. So this is sort of emblematic or representative of one of the sort of central arguments of the Quran, which I guess, Hassan, could almost be called a sort of natural theology. Do you think that's a good term for this sort of passage?
In the technical sense, maybe not, but I think in the general sense, yes. That it's not trying to it's not trying to demonstrate per se. It's not trying to demonstrate the existence of God or some aspect of God from merely natural reason, right? That's a very technical sense of natural theology.
Okay.
But in a
Okay.
general sense, I think that it's appealing to nature and using what we would think of as just akal or reason to make an argument for God. But you can even see. I mean, I'm looking at verse 30 here. The idea that the heavens and the earths were joined, and then we separated them. That's that. I think that's an allusion ultimately to the biblical account of creation, which the
Genesis
Quranic
1.
which the Quran accepts. So it's natural insofar as it's referring to nature. It's an appeal to nature, but it's very much, I think, in the tradition of biblical cosmology.
Yeah, and just, I mean, a shout out here to Arbery for his artistry there.
Yes,
If you note the sort of play here on, there are masks all sewn up and then we
unstitched.
unstitch
Yeah,
them.
that's very good.
So, yeah, not everyone can do
There
that.
is a bit of a play on words in the Arabic too. I don't, it seems to me at least, ratkan and fatak, Not, yeah,
Yeah, it could be. There's an assonance. There's
yeah,
definitely an assonance, which you can note here. Yeah, so I mean, Genesis 1, just to remind everyone, the beginning, in the beginning, things are kind of chaos. The Hebrew words in Genesis 1, I think it's verse 1, things were tohu wa bohu,
yeah. Tohu
basically means
Bohu.
like formless and whatever, chaotic or something like that.
I like very famous. Oh,
A
I can't
translator of the
forget.
Old Testament
Yes, he's
or Hebrew
very famous
Bible.
in it. Yes. Anyway, he says wild and waste. He
Oh,
renders it
nice.
as
Yeah.
wild and waste.
Yeah.
So.
Altar, maybe? Is it altar?
Altar. That's right. I
Yeah.
cannot believe I
Yeah.
forgot
Wild and Wet.
altar.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then the whole bit of basically Genesis 1 that I think goes up to Genesis 2,
Two,
verse
three.
4, the first
Yeah.
creation story, is like everything being put into order. Water's here, land there, sun for the day, moon for the night. Everything is like order. And yeah, I would agree. Like, there's that vibe. Obviously, it's not a verbatim quotation of Genesis 1, but there is the
Yeah.
sense that, like, if you look at the order of things,
Yes.
and there's kind of an allusion to their beginnings in chaos.
Right. Well,
I,
the water, and we made it from water. Or
yeah,
we created
absolutely.
from
Yeah,
water, not
yeah.
it, but
So
we created from
water
water.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, right at the beginning in the Genesis 1
Yeah.
story. But it's like, if anything, it's riffing on Genesis 1, not copying Genesis 1. There is this reference here to this. We set up the heaven as a roof. I mean, this is the
Yeah.
modern standard Arabic word saqf for roof. So Arbery, I know, has justified with this translation. As you know, the Genesis 1 rakia or something in
Yeah,
Hebrew is
Roki, yeah.
generally rendered as a firmament. No one uses that word, I don't think, in any other context.
Yeah.
Like, I don't say firmament ever except when I'm talking about Genesis 1. But, like, I mean, it does seem to call to mind a cosmology according to which there is some sort of barrier. I mean, I think that's literally what a firmament is, some sort of
Yes.
barrier. Here it's a saqf, um, that, like, that heaven is, it's not a spiritual dimension.
Right.
Uh, although, of course, theologically, Muslim thinkers will go there. But at least according to both Genesis 1 and what we find here, heaven is kind of in the same cosmos, and there's some sort of real barrier between the heaven where God and the angels are and humans. I don't know. Is that like too primitive an interpretation of this,
I think
Hassan?
it depends if you're an Antiochian or an Alexandrian, maybe.
Okay, can you
It's,
explain that
yeah,
for
of course. I mean, yeah,
for
Rakia,
listeners?
like the firmament, it's very similar. The idea is the same. A roof or a division, and a barrier on top. And is it spiritual up there? Is it material? I mean, I don't think
Well,
either.
there's the
Yeah.
passages literally of, the demons, the
Yes.
shayateen, trying to get there, and
Yeah.
they're blocked. They're trying to
But
go up on these pathways, this
yeah,
asbab, and they're blocked,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, no, that's I think that's one of the most fascinating elements of the Quran sort of worldview. But I mean, interesting to say, those are spiritual creatures, right? Both the angels, God, and the devils.
Yeah. I mean, as the genies or the jinn
Yes,
are created from fire,
fire.
and
Yeah,
angels, although it's not explicit in the Quran, are created from light. Yeah. So
but I
anyway,
could see it could go both ways. I think it sort of maybe you could make a historical account, a sort of argument that in a sort of untrained or an unphilosophical environment would think of this as a physical space
mhm.
in a more material sense. Maybe. I mean, maybe not.
Well, I mean, there's a maybe it's not the larger point, but there's a secondary point, also about passages like these, which of course, online, with all this Dawa stuff, people, try to make the case. Some people, that, oh, there's something miraculous, some knowledge of, like, things we now know about the universe that never would have been known.
Right.
I mean, anyway, just set that aside for a second. I mean, many very kind of traditional Muslim thinkers otherwise today are kind of turning away from the scientific miracle argument. which wasn't there anyway in classical Islam.
Right.
So, I mean, for me, the secondary point here is, the Quran is clearly meaning to make a sort of case for or argument about God in a very artistic way. I mean, these
Right.
verses, like the others, they rhyme. Yahtadun, mu'ridun,
Right.
yasbahun. So,
Yes.
like, it's not systematically kind of uh, even in 7th century scientific terms
Yes.
trying to describe. I mean, I don't know, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. I don't think it's a scientific claim really being, I mean, reality is being appealed to. I don't think it's trying to lay out any sort of, theory of you know, geology or cosmology as we would think it
Yeah,
today
yeah,
in physics, right? And I think really that the scientific I would say pseudoscientific reading of ancient texts is an abuse really to them.
yeah, yeah. Before we move on, I just want to comment on this, what I think is the last verse of this cosmological section.
Yes.
I mean, Arbery here, maybe not in his finest moment. He says, each swimming in a sky. I don't know why he's translating sky here for the Arabic word, which is falak. But هو الذي خلق الليل والنهار والشمس والقمر كل في فلك يسبحون. So God is the one. By the way, interesting, and we don't have to comment too much on it, that here God is speaking in
Yes, you
the
have the
first
the
person,
change. Yeah.
plural, and now someone, narrator, is
And
speaking
he,
about
yeah,
God,
in the
yeah, in
third
the third
person.
person. But anyway, this is interesting. Usually people understand this word falak to refer to what I think is understood in late antique cosmology or whatever as a celestial orbit. I don't know much about about the whole idea, but I think the idea is that, like, you look up in the sky and it's kind of like you have this idea there's kind of an arched universe above you, and then the planets who follow kind of the same path across the sky, and the sun and the moon, which obviously also follow the same path, they each have kind of their designated space, right? Isn't that the idea?
Yeah, the celestial spheres. You can't hear them at night, Gabriel? No. Aristotle said that you could, if you listen
Oh,
closely,
really?
sometimes you could hear
You
them.
could hear them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I
because
agree,
there's sometimes
absolutely.
I know in like Neoplatonism they
Yeah.
become like beings, sentient beings or something. But
Yes. But I think here too, I want to point out that this is very much sort of following, at least theoretically, the movements of, the very popular, well-known biblical creation account, right? You have the separation of the heaven and the earth, and then shortly after, you have the appointing of the sun and the moon,
totally. Yeah,
as ruling the night and the
the
day.
sun gets a day, moon
Yes,
gets a night.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
totally, totally.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, this might be kind of weird, so someone might bully me in the comment section, but I just want to point out here, okay, this last word in modern standard Arabic does
Yes,
mean they
swim.
swim. Okay, so that's a standard understanding of yasbahun, and obviously Arbery's followed that. So as for the Arabic word falak, which I suggested instead of sky could be celestial orbit. I mean, it's just worth noting that we also have the word fulk in the
Yes.
Quran, which refers to a kind of boat, maybe coming from a Greek word. And I just, boat, swimming, I don't know if there's some connection. Okay, let's just carry on. I want to point out to a very different kind of phenomenon we find in Quran 21. I'm thinking, Hassan, like looking at the time, we're not gonna. This may be just part one of. Uh,
This always happens.
okay, so I just want to point out something interesting and very common in the Quranic text, which is a verse such as 36, 30, 34 is kind of similar. But let's look at 36. Okay, so here we have an address that the addressee is referred to in the second person singular. So the Arabic pronoun is ka. And a cool thing about Arbery's old style of English is he differentiates between second person singular and second person plural by using the Old English thee, right? So when the unbelievers behold thee, they take thee only for mockery. Okay, and then he has this nice word that's not really in the Arabic, ha. Okay, forgetting ha for a second. I mean, I just find this important to note. I think it has parallels in the Hebrew prophet literature.
Sure.
Um, that what's going on in literary terms here is actually interesting. That in principle, God is having this intimate conversation with Muhammad, right? This is God
Yes.
saying, at least according to the normal understanding, God is saying, when they behold thee, O Muhammad, they take thee only for mockery. And then God quotes in this intimate conversation to Muhammad what they've said about him, as though he's been, God has been listening in to what the opponents say. And so he quotes their insult of Muhammad. And, in English, you have quotation marks. Arbery's British, so he uses just one. So God is saying to Muhammad intimately, I know that they say, ha, is this the one, etc. And then he continues uh, um, uh, by saying to Muhammad, as a guess, it's meant to be a kind of assurance. I know these are unbelievers, or they reject if dhikr means the revelation, they deny the revelation.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Like you're listening. So the effect is that the reader or listener of the Quran is listening in
Yes.
on an intimate conversation. Sorry I went on so long, but what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what more I can really add there. I think you're right. Here we get a little uh yeah, I mean, the Quran often does this, but it gives you a sort of window into the messenger and God sort of discoursing, maybe in his heart, or maybe he's hearing it, or I don't know. But I think the motif of mocking
Can I
is
ask
interesting.
about that? Sorry, Hassan, to
Yeah,
jump in.
please.
What do you think is the intended effect? Like, why would a scripture want to create this experience of like, you're listening? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you do have something like that, I think, in the Old Testament prophets, right? Like, the Lord called to me or something.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
or
like
like,
God is
or
speaking right to Isaiah
you
or
get God's speech to the prophets all the time.
the individual
Comfort,
prophet as
yeah,
well, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a lot one could say. Are you supposed to be sort of put in the shoes of, the messenger, sort of called to
That's a good
a
point.
similar sort of response to God, right? The messenger being the sort of model for piety and response and submission to God's will. Vis-a-vis the opponents, the mockers. I want to make a quick note on the
Yeah,
mockers too. This is again a very common motif in the Quran. I mean,
yeah,
mentioned multiple times, even in Surah Baqarah. So yeah,
yeah. Like this.
I will say there's a certain consistency to the Quran's presentation of its opponents as mockers and making certain sort of accusations against the messenger. And I don't want to say it's predictable, but you can sort of almost anticipate what the response will be.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, great. And just to note, Arbery thoughtfully puts remembrance in a cap with a capital letter here because he's suggesting that the dhikr, this
Yes.
Arabic word that means remembrance, is actually an allusion to divine revelation, the heavenly book. And yeah, it's interesting. Dhikr Rahman. I think some people think that the use of Ar-Rahman, that is the All Merciful, as a name for God, is typical of this period. If it's okay, let's
Let's
jump
keep
ahead.
going.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wanted to comment on this verse 47. I mean, in part because it has mustard seed.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's important, right? That it presumably tells us something that something very small is referred to as a mustard seed in the Quran.
Yes, and I mean, one doesn't even have to introduce why this is important, but I'll just make it clear. This is, of course, the mustard seed is a favorite in the parables of Jesus, and the Quran takes up the motif of the mustard seed.
Yeah, which would suggest that I've read a bit about this, and I've even written a bit about this use of mustard seed in the Quran, and basically, I mean, it's pretty clear it's connected to
Absolutely.
Christian literature, especially the Gospels. There are some references to mustard seeds, like in the Talmud and stuff in Judaism, but I mean that's that there are lots of small things, and elsewhere the Quran uses like a mosquito or a gnat to refer to like God and his parable telling. So there's other small things you could refer to. There's a word, I think it's darra or something, that is, or durra is taken to mean sometimes an atom, probably inaccurately. So there's other small things you could point to that it chooses mustard seed. I think is not
Yeah.
coincidental. You know what I mean? Okay, but also I just want to ask your thoughts too about this scenario, like kind of in a higher level theological way. This verse says, "And we, that is God, we shall set up the just balances for the resurrection day." It's plural for balance. The Arabic word is plural, not dual. There, so that no one soul shall be wronged anything, even if it were as small as a mustard seed, we shall produce it. Uh, so, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts about this, but theologically, there is this sense where the Quran is telling its audience that, in the end, it is like a counting up of good things and bad things.
Yeah.
And if the balance, think of an old school balance,
Yes.
has too many bad deeds in it, maybe including unbelief, you'll be punished.
Yeah, and that God accounts for everything. I want to ask you, Gabriel, as this sort of marks the beginning of the a narrative of the prophets as well.
Right,
So,
right here in 48.
yes, in the next
Yeah,
verse. So,
yeah, we can
do
turn
you
to
have
that.
any? Yeah, well, yeah. Do you have any thoughts about the transition, or the preceding part and the coming part?
I mean, it's a clear transition. I mean, we have no references, I think, in the first 47 verses to any biblical figure, and then suddenly, we'll see it almost reads like a litany, but a litany meaning like, in a liturgical sense, a litany is a mention of holy people one after another.
Sure.
It's a kind of prayerful song, maybe, seeking the aid or just praising holy people one after another. So, yeah, it's a pretty dramatic change. And I mean, like, generally, I think it's interesting that the Quran is so interesting in staking a claim on biblical figures.
Yes.
Because, in a
Yes.
sense, let's say you have, this guy, he's making a claim to be a prophet. You don't have to stake. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to stake claims on biblical figures. I mean, in theory, you could, appeal to something else. Maybe this is a stupid example, but I was thinking, as far as I know, Sikhism, which began in the Punjab a couple hundred years ago, it's a monotheistic religion that doesn't appeal, I think, to the biblical tradition. I don't know if you know anything more
I
about
I
it.
know I know next to
Yeah,
nothing
but I mean, at
about
least
Sikhism.
I guess that doesn't matter. Let's set that aside. Someone will laugh at me in the comments for maybe getting something wrong about Sikhism.
No,
But I
it's
mean, at
okay.
least in principle, it didn't have to. So yeah, that's an important point that it does. There's interesting language in this verse. First, there's
Yes.
this word furqan.
I was just going to
Um,
ask you
yeah,
about these two words, actually. What do you think Furqan here is is referencing? Is it just a sort of criterion or something like that, or is it a scripture? Is it a reference to scripture?
the key point is that in Arabic the root faraqa, so
Yes.
which kind of gives us this word, has something to do with dividing. So as Hassan says, it's often thought of as a criterion, but then look, Hassan, how Arbery translates it
Yes. The
as
salvation.
salvation.
That's
Yeah.
maybe a bit too much of a too liberal of a move, in my opinion.
Why?
Salvation.
I mean, he's drawing from the Aramaic, right?
Right. Wait.
Which
Fair enough. fair enough.
Yeah, Furqana in Aramaic, I guess means something like salvation.
Yeah, you'd really have to. I mean, this is a whole another tangent on the sort of validity of that move in translation or in understanding the Quran, but
Wait, because you're saying that
because it's
just
making it an
because.
appeal to I mean, it's wholesale lifting the meaning of the verse and of the word from some Syriac rather than from Arabic, because Furqan has meaning in Arabic too, right? And within the rest of the corpus of the Quran, I mean, the Quran itself refers it to itself as a Furqan.
Yeah, now just to be clear, you're not saying here that the community of believers, that is the tradition, sort of must establish what a word means, sort of after the Quran. You're saying that in the Arabic in which the Quran was being proclaimed already, this
Yes.
word, even if it had origin somehow in Syriac Aramaic,
Yeah.
um, probably meant something different.
Yeah, I think so, especially given how it's used elsewhere. So, but I also want to ask you, I mean, I'd love your thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, I can try to think of some quick examples, just with French, for example, where, words which are related historically have different meanings. For example, like important,
Yes.
French important, doesn't really mean the same. Like important in French can mean like something that's just kind of expensive.
Right.
Like it has dimensions of meaning. I think intéressant can be more positive in French as opposed to English interesting. So
Latin
yeah,
and English. I mean, if you're ever, I've made many sort of failed attempts to study Latin in my life, and there it's sort of the siren call of the cognate,
yeah,
of a term that sounds very familiar
yeah,
in
right,
English.
right. Yeah, in the
Yeah,
world in which, yeah,
yeah,
its existing might mean something
yeah.
different. Yeah, so anyway, I mean, I think maybe we should carry on
Can I
a
ask you
little
one
bit.
last question about this
Yeah,
verse?
totally.
What do you make of the next word, wadia?
Yeah,
So, do you think
yeah.
a
So this is
wadia
related to
is
light. So
yes?
dia is related to the modern standard Arabic word though. I think that's a beautiful translation that Arbery gives, radiance.
Do you think it's a
Wigan.
reference to Moses' face and the
Oh,
radiance that it gave off?
I mean, there's a lot of the light language in the
Yes,
Quran, though. That's the problem. Like, obviously, Allahu Nur samawati wal ard. God is a light. It's a different word.
yes,
Yeah, so it's tough. Yeah, Nur. Also, I think beginning of Quran 5, Nur shows up. So, I mean, yeah, and then obviously light, is all over the Bible, Christian spirituality in the patristic period.
right.
Um, uh, I'm the light of the world. That's it. Is that John's gospel?
Yes, 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 of course.
And then even in the synoptic gospels, isn't sort of the gospel itself that is the message. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a
Yes.
bushel.
Yeah, I agree. This is largely speculative, but that's sort of immediately where
Yeah.
my mind goes.
And now you give me the opportunity because we could say one more thing about Quran 48, just kind of for fun here. First of all, note that the nickname of the second caliph, Omar, is El Faruq,
Yes,
so related to this word. And that's one of the arguments that Krona and Crook,
yes. That it's a messianic
sorry,
title
Professor Cook,
in
sorry, I must say
Hagerism.
Cook. Yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah, one of the arguments that Krona and Cook, in their famous or infamous book, Hagerism, um, uh, attribute or use to sort of say, there's Jewish influence and stuff on things,
Yes. Let's
because
keep going.
Omar conquering Jerusalem in 636 or 637 was welcomed by the Jews as a sort of savior. We're moving on now, into this narrative section. We'll see. We may not get very far here, but this is a great conversation here. And so Abraham sort of begins right here, just to say one or two things about kind of the biblical subtext to this Abraham passage. Here we have a story of Abraham confronting his people. This, Hassan, is just not what we have in Genesis at all. I mean, the way the first book of the Bible works is you have these kind of big kind of massive primordial stories up to Genesis 11. Then Genesis 12, you kind of start the story of Abraham, but you like immediately go to his travels to Canaan. And you don't see him confronting this people back in Mesopotamia. Um, yeah, I mean, just jump in at any point or interrupt me. But like the thing that there's certain things which provoke this in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. There are allusions to the idolatry of the people in Mesopotamia,
Right.
and then stories are born that appear in the extra or parabiblical literatures. So there's a book called Jubilees, a Jewish book, which is not in the Bible, kind of an extra book. And then there's a book that's, might have been written initially by Jews, but is transmitted by Christians. By the way, Jubilees also becomes transmitted by Christians in Ethiopia. But this other book is called The Apocalypse of Abraham, which transmitted by Christians. In both of those books, Jubilees and The Apocalypse of Abraham, both of which were written before the Qur'an, we have this story of Abraham confronting his people.
Exactly. I thought that was just important to mention. So thank you.
Yeah, and like he's tough. In Jubilees, I'm pretty sure he's a child. I think he is an Apocalypse of Abraham as well. And he confronts his dad.
Yeah.
What are these statues unto which you are cleaving? Like that means holding close to in
That's a great translation, I think.
Yeah, and again, direct speech attributed to the opponents, but in this case, what Mehdi Azayas calls past counter discourse. So they say, the opponents of Abraham now, not of Muhammad,
Yes.
we found our fathers serving them. Interesting that the Quran tends to comment on this, that the allegiance to one's ancestral religion is a major obstacle, is like a big problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, anyway, let's just fast forward because there is a controversy that takes place here. I mean, just to summarize the story, if you look up at verse 57, Abraham himself says, basically, I will play a trick. It's kind of gently translated as outwit, but basically it says, means I will play a trick on your idols, once you turn around, you idolaters. So what is the trick? Abraham breaks them, right? And they come back and they're like, wait, why did you break our idols? Who did this? Who broke these idols? So they bring up Abraham, are you the one who did this? And then Abraham says, no, it was this great one, which presumably means the biggest idol, because, in Arabic it's kabiruhum,
right.
The biggest of the idols that did it. And then he says, question them, ask the idols if they are able to speak. I mean, the problem is set up here for Muslim interpreters because it seems like Abraham has lied.
Yeah.
So, I mean, could you just comment on what's the problem with Abraham lying? Why would
Yeah.
that be?
Well, for our listeners who are unfamiliar, there is a view in Islamic theology that develops over the first few centuries that the prophets were sort of morally perfect men. This also transforms into a polemic against the accounts of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible this is much later. But that they do all this sort of immoral stuff, and therefore this must be corrupted text. But this would pose a problem because if Abraham lies, then he's not morally perfect. How could someone so close to God and literally the friend of God, who's often called the friend of God, lie?
I just want to note though that, I mean, what does it mean to be perfect?
Yeah, that's a very important question.
We often hear these doctrines or things said about this religion or that religion, So, people might just say, Muslims believe the prophets are perfect. Isma is the Arabic word, they're masumin.
Yeah.
Or masumun if you understand Arabic. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be masum? What does it mean to be perfect? That's a hard question actually to answer, right? I don't know, this might get a little philosophical, but there are various kind of paradoxes that people ask where in this or that scenario, maybe lying would actually be the better thing to do than telling the truth. I don't know if I want to comment on that at all,
Right.
but
I mean, this is a perennial debate in Christian theology as well as I mean, Islamic theology, and I think philosophy generally. What would be a just lie? All the way going back all the way, of course, to Plato in the Republic, he has the noble lie that must be told, and to sort of convince people that their soul is this or that metal or this or that worth. And later, Augustine deals with it too, whether it's just to lie to save a life or something like that. And I think this is, I mean, it's a similar question. Is he lying? Is he just, is it so obvious that, it's sort of,
Good point.
rhetorically
Yeah,
playful?
yeah.
You
Great
know,
point. Yeah,
hard to
and
say.
I mean, some Muslim interpreters make just that point. Like,
Right.
he, his goal in saying an untruth was not to deceive. Like, he didn't actually, like,
Right.
the
This is
goal of him
Razi.
saying this was not for them to think that, the biggest idol actually did it. The goal of them, of rather, his goal was to lead them
Yes.
along a certain sequence of, thoughts that would ultimately lead them to recognizing that, the
Yeah.
idols are not
He's not
gods.
trying to deceive them into thinking actually that it was the biggest idol, you
And
know.
so, I mean, Hassan, does this mean that, like, the Quran is more thoughtful about, human nature and ethical problems than, say, a simplistic view that prophets never lie would be?
It depends how simplistic the view of is, right? So if it's something like, they never say anything, even poetically discordant with reality, probably. But I think the Quran sort of knows it, like there's a humor in this,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
That
The
I think
prophet
it's
of
obvious.
Abraham is like
Yes.
intentionally funny.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
yes,
almost chuckled as we were rereading it here.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I think it's obvious that the Quran in this account here that Abraham's not literally not trying to sell them on the biggest idol doing it, but is trying to make a sort of a higher point. So
And,
insofar as that's true, I think the Quran is engaged in a sort of more in this sort of higher discourse.
and I'll make one final comment here. I'm going to stop the share too. I'm going to one final comment about this question of Abraham lying and all of that. Just to note that Islamic tradition, you know, obviously when it comes to moral ethical questions, also thinks seriously about that. And there's a section um, in Bukhari's hadith, for example, dedicated to the question of whether one can, basically speak in an indirect way for this or that reason.
Right.
Like there's a hadith in which the Prophet refers to women as glass vessels. And so then the problem is like, is that a lie? They're not
Hmm.
actually glass vessels. And, the hadith says, no, no, it's obviously not a lie. It's just a manner of speech. So, I mean, texts and literature and ethics are all complicated. And
Yeah, and we will really have to complete this read through of Surah 21 again, but I think it's one of the most interesting chapters of the Quran. So there's
totally.
just a lot. There's a lot to unpack. Could go on for much more than an hour. So
Yeah, there's a lot more. There's some very famous verses. Muhammad as a mercy to the world or to
right.
all people. Maybe the only direct quotation of the Bible comes up also towards the end of this chapter. So there will be a part two. So we made it basically halfway through.
Yes.
So we'll carry on with part two at some point. And yeah, friends, thanks if you're still listening now. Thank you so much for being with us. Please take a moment to go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, tell everyone else to do the same. Yeah, thanks, Hassan.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gabriel.